Right, Moon Nazis. I thought I'd start the new year with a video that is a little bit more interesting and fun to do. So I did the video on the fake moon landing and Vox's take on it and Owen Benjamin's take on it. And my view on it was just basically that yes, we did go to the moon, but we didn't go the way they say we went. And you know, I've got quite a lot of friends that we joke around with this stuff on, and we talk about it, and they essentially say that I'm like the moon Nazi guy, you know. That's because I wrote a couple of books. This one being, it's the same book, it's just got two different covers. There you go. There, you can probably read it there. Overlords of Mars. And it's a series of books. And Amazon has changed their stuff, like from Create Space to Kindle. So I don't know how you can get which cover. They're both covered, you know, both covers. I think on this one, it's got my name as just that. And on this one, it's got my name as the full name. So maybe that's how you can see which one has got which cover, if you prefer one over the other. Weirdly enough, most people seem to prefer this cover over the Mars with a pretty face on it. Anyway, the thing is, this is a fiction book, but in this fiction book, there are sections which are not fiction at all. They're based on absolute history. And in this part one of the Moon Nazis, I wanted to discuss a little bit the propaganda, or the Vox and Owen recently did videos on what they call wizardry and spellcasters and changing people's reality by with words, which is pretty much a field I've been in very deeply for 15 years or so, which involves hypnosis, brainwashing, and altering people's perception of reality. In fact, the Nazis were really the first people that used propaganda in a massive way. And it works in ways that the average person doesn't expect it to work on them, but it does. And there are many, probably the best way to explain how propaganda works is to explain the two extremes. And you know, the reality generally tends to lie somewhere in between. So on one end, it's a very slow trickle-down effect that pervades everything. And we've seen this in the last 50, 60, 70 years. And it started out, I would say one of the pivotal points at which it started to divert was pretty much after the Second World War. With a lot of different things happen after the Second World War that seem not related, but actually are. And that's sort of one of my skills, is to syncretize a lot of different information into a coherent whole that sort of patches together. And not patches together because I want it to, but because I keep investigating until the connections show themselves, and then that's the correct way to create an overall theory of something, rather than trying to make things fit because you've got a pet theory. It's just look at what the information is and where it leads you, and if some of these things link up, which they eventually tend to do in one way or another, that will inform whatever theory you come up with. Now, the interesting thing is that, let's start right from the beginning. You know, did Hitler really die in that bunker? No, I don't believe he did. Neither did the Russians at the time, and really very few people believed he actually died in the bunker at the time that it happened. As it happens, the piece of skull that is supposedly belonging to Hitler, that was in the Russian archives, has now been demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that it's a female skull, so it couldn't be Hitler's. And the photographs of the supposedly dead Hitler after he'd suicided himself, the Russians, again, have known this for many, many years, because right after Hitler was supposedly found dead, the Russian leader was unconvinced that Hitler was dead at all. And the Russians have a slightly different way of investigating things than the Western side, and they've got advances in certain technologies that the West doesn't even really know about even today. One of them was that apparently the human ear, you know, if you look at a human ear from the side, it's a little bit like a fingerprint in that it's unique. The photographs of the so-called dead Hitler didn't match other photographs of Hitler, so it wasn't his ear. Now, it's absolutely well known that Hitler had many doppelgangers, you know, like people that looked like him or that were made to look like him, so that he had body doubles. Again, I'm going to refer to a couple of people that have done some pretty good investigative work. More recently, a book called Grey Wolf. I don't have it with me because a lot of my, like 17 boxes of my books have been stored with at my dad's place and far away. So, but Grey Wolf was recently published a few years ago, and it essentially says, you know, that Hitler did not die in the bunker and probably died somewhere in Argentina. Now, the thing is, this book came out a few years ago, but essentially it's a rewrite with a rehash with a couple of bits more data here and there of a book that was written in the 70s by an Argentinian entitled Hitler Died in Argentina. Now, I don't know if you know this or not, but Argentina had an area, and I don't want to lie because I don't remember the exact size, but I think it was something like 10,000 square kilometers. I speak under correction. It was a vast, vast area. It's like a small country that you could not access at all unless you had an SS ID. And it was totally controlled by ex-Nazi Germans. We know very well that, and it's been extremely well documented, well presented, that many Nazis went to Argentina and even had plastic surgery and disappeared. Kammler was a Nazi officer in charge of all the top secret weapons of the Germans, died 4 times. Apparently Kammler, there was 4 different versions of where he died, where he got killed, where he suicided himself. And this guy was never found, you know, so there were quite a few of these top-level Nazis that just sort of disappeared. A guy who's quite good at giving this information, I've mentioned him before, and I've got a few of his books. I'm just going to mention him again because he's really does quite a lot of in-depth research, and he's written. I really like this book because there's a lot of information here. Reich of the Black Sun. The author is Joseph P. Farrell, and he's also got a website which he's got all sorts of. Owen Benjamin came up with the term conspiracy queries, and I think it's a very good term. So I'm going to use that instead of conspiracy theories because it's conspiracy queries. It's questions, you know, about conspiracies and how they happen. This one is a little bit more document heavy. Tracing things down, but anyway, the fact that the Nazis did not get defeated, they got defeated militarily, but they never surrendered. You know, from a official Nazi party, there was never a surrender from any one of those guys. There was a recent program that I thought was a fantastic piece of propaganda, where they're saying that Martin Bormann's remains were found in the place where an eyewitness of, you know, from the 1940s reported seeing him get shot, and it just sort of got paved over as a parking lot or a piece of road or something, and now they did some works there, and lo and behold, so Martin Bormann, at the end of the war, trying to run out from the last gasp of the Nazi Empire, gets shot in the middle of the road. And then, well, they just pave over him, you know? And 50 years later, we find him, and through DNA, we know that he was there. He was dead. That's absolute bullshit, okay? Martin Bormann did not die in Germany. I'm absolutely convinced that Martin Bormann was in Argentina. Martin Bormann escaped from Nazi Germany in what they call the rat lines. And Martin Bormann, in fact, and Joseph Farrell presents a brilliant case for this. Martin Bormann was probably involved in the supplying of the material that you needed to create the atom bombs. And I've just got senior moment or a brain fart moment at the moment. I can't remember the exact name of the material, but it's you needed cyclotrons to create the radioactive material that you need to put in an atom bomb. The Manhattan Project didn't have enough of it. If you look at the production of the stuff that they did over the from the beginning of the Manhattan Project, they just didn't have enough of it. But the Germans did. And in fact, Auschwitz, which supposedly Auschwitz was a rubber manufacturing plant, it was also a death camp, where they worked people to death. But in Auschwitz didn't produce a single kilo of rubber. So what the hell was it actually doing? And it consumed more energy per day than Berlin. Auschwitz had a whole bunch of stuff that just didn't make sense. But that did make sense if they were using lasers to create enriched uranium. I believe that's what they just come back to me now, I think, unless I'm wrong. To create this enriched, you need to create this enriched uranium to create the atom bomb that was eventually dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it looks like the deal was Martin Bormann in 70 or 80 gold either plated or gold lined containers delivered the missing amount of enriched uranium that was required for the atom bomb to the Americans, and as a result of that was allowed to escape to Argentina. And in fact, a submarine with these cylinders, gold-lined cylinders in it, was allowed to go through to the Atlantic, even though it was sort of stopped by the British, I believe, or it was discovered by the British, and they were told to stand off and let it go through. Then there is, of course, also the arrival of 2 submarines in Mar del Plata in Argentina months after the war ended. And these guys just sort of surrendered themselves and kind of got caught and said, yeah, well, they didn't ever explain why they were at sea for months and what the hell they were doing out there. So here's the thing that's really well known. The Nazis had multiple secret bases throughout the world. And they had these starting from the late 30s. In fact, even the mid-30s, they had already started to build these things all over the place. There are some on the Canary Islands. There's some in South America. There's some throughout Europe. They had built fortified positions and bolt holes all over the world. Now, one of the supposed ones that wasn't really true, did it not happen, was a secret base in Antarctica. And of course, in my fiction book, I get into that. So if you're into like moon Nazis, this is a pretty good story, and the Nazis appear a bit later on the 3rd book, which I'm still busy writing because I've had a lot of life stuff getting in the way. But anyway, to get back to the moon Nazis. So all these things sort of seem to connect. There is some fairly strong and decent evidence that the Nazis did in fact have a base in Antarctica, and Project High Jump, which is still classified and involved Admiral Byrd, one of the most preeminent explorers, American explorers of the poles, and his diaries are still unaccessible, still state secrets. And this guy went to Antarctica in 1947 with a huge, 4,000 or 5,000 soldiers. They had like warships, planes, helicopters, I think tanks as well. And they were supposed to be out there for 8-9 months. Now, the war's just ended. Nobody's got a whole bunch of money to throw away on like random things. So why the hell were they going there? They came back after a few weeks, having lost men, machinery, airplanes, and Admiral Byrd was interviewed by a journalist of El Mercurio on the ship on the way back, and he stated unambiguously that America would have to be careful, would have to worry about craft that could fly and and could do things that no craft that he knew about could do, of polar origin. Now, later on they tried to make it out as if Admiral Byrd lost his mind or whatever. This guy didn't lose his mind. He was a well-decorated admiral. He was a very sensible man. And I believe that he was sent out there to root out the last couple of Nazis that had probably survived or been stashed away in an Antarctic base. I believe there's a good possibility that that's true. I'm not saying it's absolutely the case, but on the balance of probabilities, I would say that's possible. At least possible, if not likely. So what happened? Well, what happened is, if that's the case, if they did go there to root out some Nazis from the last base in Antarctica, I think they got their ass kicked. And there's good evidence that they did get their ass kicked by anti-gravity machines that were being controlled by Nazis. In other words, the Nazis had developed essentially anti-gravity machines, or Hanebu craft, with weapons on them that could kick the crap out of anything that we had back in the late 40s in terms of airplanes and ships and so on, especially in an environment as unfriendly as Antarctica. Now the thing is that shortly after this, you had the Roswell incident, and the Roswell incident initially was not aliens from another planet. Initially was aliens as in of foreign origin, as in Germans, as in Nazi. And there is a guy that has even managed to come across a piece of Nazi of equipment that supposedly was on one of these craft that's got the Nazi emblem on it, and it's some kind of altimeter or whatever. Now, I don't know that any of this is exactly how it happened, but if you look at a timeline, if the Nazis did have a secret base in Antarctica, if they did have technological wonder weapons, as they call them, which they did, okay? You know the band, the Foo Fighters? You know where that name comes from? Foo Fighters? The Allied forces, when they were bombing Germany, some of their planes got taken out by these glowing balls of light that would just float up and sort of destroy planes. And the pilots didn't know what to call them. They called them Foo Fighters because it was just like foo, a little ball, a glowing ball of something. The Nazis had like weird weapons. I'm gonna try and look for one of them because I don't want to get it wrong. And I know that there are there's one of the weapons that they had was something that basically flat up attached itself to the wings of planes like a mine and would blow them up. So they had weapons that we still haven't really quite understood today. I can't find it right now, but anyway, in this book there's sections, like I said, of real history, and in there it describes some of the weapons that the Nazis had, which we still haven't got a clue about. I was actually going to do a master's degree in electromechanical engineering, and I sort of set up to do it in a year full-time or 2 years part-time. And then I broke my Achilles tendon and a whole bunch of other stuff, and so I didn't ever get around to it. But I had an agreement with quite a forward-looking professor in the UK who was going to be okay with me to do a project for this master's thesis on the recreation of what is essentially a battery that was used in the submarines of the Nazis, which nobody still understands quite how it works, because it's got 6 or so magnets in a configuration that seems to create energy out of thin air. It was a top secret document, so there's some schematics, but not the whole thing is understood. So my intention was to recreate this thing and use the university to make it a proper scientific experiment that could be documented and so on. I believe there are people that have probably redone it, recreated it. Thomas Townsend Brown, a retired Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Townsend Brown, has, with a friend of his whose name slips my mind at the moment, certainly created over Unity devices and devices that recreate some of the anti-gravity properties that the Thomas Townsend initial anti-gravity device that is still enshrined in physics books as the Byfield-Brown effect. Thomas Townsend Brown has repeated some of this stuff, I believe, and created machines that built machines where he even gives you the schematics of how to build it yourself in one of his books. I gave that book to an electrical engineer friend of mine, so I haven't got one lying about. But anyway, the point is anti-gravity exists, and it is, I would say, almost without a shadow of a doubt, factual that the Nazis were ahead of the Americans in terms of developing or redeveloping anti-gravity technology. Why do I say redeveloping? Because, well, the reason I came across anti-gravity originally was when I wrote this book about, 23 years ago now. It's quite a thick book. It's over 500 pages, been updated in 2014. And, this book talks about the face on Mars and the fact that the Martian artifacts are artificial. I'm convinced of that. All the evidence scientifically measured out to the nth degree points to those items being artificial things. And NASA has been extremely dodgy with regard to that information on every level. But, NASA does stand for never a straight answer, so no surprises there. But one piece that I hadn't connected, now I knew anti-gravity technology must exist. I knew about Townsend Brown, I knew about Tesla, I knew all this stuff. I knew about the sort of the fact that the space shuttle had filmed these anti-gravity machines in certain of their videos. And I'm just going to quickly see if I can find the name of the mission that filmed the shooting of UFOs from the space shuttle. It was SFS, I can't remember the number, that's why I'm trying to find it quickly. But in any case, the point is that anti-gravity technology exists and has existed for a long time. But if the face on Mars was is an artificial object, if there were buildings on Mars, somebody had to have lived there at some point in time. Nobody's living there now, although, well, let's say not the original people, right? So the theory of why Mars went from a water-rich planet that had rivers and seas to a dead world is in here, and it's based on pure science. I wrote this 23 years ago. Every prediction I made in here, everything that I said in here, if A, B, and C, then D. So, there's certain logical things that follow. In other words, if Mars could harbor life at one point, it must have had a magnetosphere. That was one of the things I didn't know when I wrote this book. And I said, but if that's the case, then it must have had a magnetosphere. Turns out that shortly after the book was published, I found out that that was in fact the case, that Mars did have a magnetosphere, and it doesn't have one now. So why didn't it have one now? And I get into that, that's explained here as well. So this book, The Face on Mars, is a good reference, but that's why I don't give a lot of references now and whatever. I've done that work a long time ago. This book is chock full of references on just about every page. You've got little footnotes, and the footnotes refer to the footnotes. It's very, when I wrote this, the internet was pretty new. So a lot of this reference material is really hardcore paper stuff. And that's how I got to find out about the anti-gravity technology. But I hadn't made the connection between Nazi wonder weapons and anti-gravity technology until quite a long time later. And the amazing thing that you should keep in mind, regardless of all this, Nazi weapons and flying saucers and flying submarines and whatever, what you have to keep in mind is the brilliance of the Nazi survivors of the Nazi war, like Martin Bormann, Hitler, and whoever else of the top guys that did get away, got to Argentina. And they got away with billions in gold, diamonds, precious stones, stolen art, a lot of money. There are even documents that purport to show the signature of Juan Perón, the leader of Argentina at the time, and Martin Bormann on the same piece of paper. And nobody has actually proven these things to be in any way false. So we know that Argentina was extremely supportive of the Nazi regime. We know that Argentina, just before the end of the war, they'd been neutral the whole time. Just before the end of the war, they sort of said, okay, now we'll come and help and we'll fight the Nazis too. And they flew over some huge planes, loaded up a bunch of stuff and flew back out. So they basically joined the Allied forces in the last closing end days of the war, or either just before or just after, I forget. And sort of went into Berlin and loaded up a whole bunch of stuff and left. Nazi Germany definitely was ahead on many of the technologies. This is not in question. I mean, any historian will tell you that. The jet engine was first invented by the Nazis. The stealth technology that we are now using that the Americans are now using on planes and so on was originally first invented for the Nazi submarines. They had a lot of stuff that they were ahead on. And they were spending a huge amount of money in researching the craziest of ideas. They also had some brilliant people. I mean, one guy whose name I forget, he was a guy who essentially invented the fuel air bomb, and he liked explosives and whatever, to his detriment, because one of them went off and blew off his hands, made him blind and sort of deaf, and so after that he wasn't very functional anymore. But a brilliant physicist. This guy is the only guy I know who's got a theory of physics that encompasses not only gravity, electromagnetics, and so on, which is correct, because anti-gravity does affect, is somehow involved in the both gravity and electromagnetic fields. So the so-called unified field theory of Einstein has been engineered to the point where we've got anti-gravity machines. They're not publicly talked about, they're not discussed about, and maybe even if you talk too much about them, you certainly a few years ago, you would have an accident happen to you if you were a certain type of person. There are very good physicists that were, looking at things like the Philadelphia experiment and faster than light travel and anti-gravity machines, and they went missing. It's also interesting, but to get back to the original propaganda, the original Nazis were brilliant at manipulating the world's zeitgeist, the worldview of people. They were brilliant at doing that. They were the first people who really pioneered it. Even the Nazi symbol, I mean, look, the Nazi flag has got black, red, and white. That the Nazi flag would essentially, this is a picture of Mars, but actually, if you take the white circle of the Nazi flag, it's a very powerful symbol. Symbolically, it's in your face. You sort of, that's why it's sort of banned in Germany and so on. It's a very powerful symbol, and human minds work with symbols. So it's not just that. They changed the view of the world, and when they lost the war, they didn't really lose the war. Werner von Braun told one of the people he worked with, a woman called Elizabeth, I forget her surname, but anyway, this lady has gone in front of Senate hearings and is on record, okay? She worked with Werner von Braun for a few years, and towards the end of his life, Werner von Braun used to tell her that, like, look, this is how we've done it. We've lost the war, but we're going to control the world. And they had enough money. What you need to understand is that after the Second World War, there was thousands of companies created with Nazi gold, with Nazi money. These companies, thousands of them, like registered as companies that were originally German or belonging to German people or under the control of Germans that were involved with the Nazi regime. IG Farben, IBM, all of these companies have got Nazi origins. It's really interesting if you go back and trace the money. So trace the money. And if you trace the money, you find out that, well, the Nazis essentially created the Apollo program for the Americans, because Project Paperclip took 3,000 Nazi scientists to America and made them work for the Americans. But what happened is that essentially American ideology became slightly Nazi influenced. And, you know, for those of us that are not American, haven't lived in America, but have visited. I mean, my first visit to the States was in the 1990s, 1996. And I spent a few months there. And back in 1996, I found America to be a police state of semi-brainwashed, very friendly people. You know, some of my American friends will say, you didn't visit America, you were like in Yankee towns, you know, and you were in California. But I was in Arizona as well, and I liked Arizona the best, I gotta admit. And I didn't visit, you know, all the places. I was in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where I was interviewed on TV because of my book and stuff and so on. But in essence, the Nazis gave some of the technology to the Americans to enable them to do the Apollo program, and in a way also kind of changed the mind, changed the way of thinking of people to be more Nazi ideology. Werner von Braun is on record through this lady that worked with him as saying that, look, this is what we keep doing. We keep having this Cold War. Now it's America versus Russia. Later it will be countries of interest, you know, like terrorist countries. Then after that, it's going to be, you know, the rocks from space. That's going to be the next thing. And then after that, alien invasion. And he laughed about it. A faked alien invasion. It says, and all of this is just so that we can get out of, you know, develop this technology to we're controlling the whole planet, but we're really sort of off planet. And we've got access to technology that's beyond the planet. As I've mentioned in the last videos, there's a British hacker who is also somewhat autistic, who managed to hack his way into like, you know, Department of Defense computers in America, and found lists of ships and lists of officers and soldiers based on ships that were not Earth-based ships, like spaceships. And some of these lists had like over 300 people on them. So these are big ships. And all of the stuff that is factually based, I've put in here as a, you know, I made a story out of it. And it's, you know, the first book is more an introduction to a lot of these facts, because most people don't know that a lot of the stuff is real. And then the second book becomes pretty cinematic in that it's, you know, more adventure and sort of, but there's a bit of both in everything. I'm also, I guess, the inventor of the space erotica or whatever, because there's some pretty graphic scenes, especially in the second book, which in science fiction tends to not be very much there, but is in this, because there is a thread, there are many long loops in this story. It's supposed to be 3 books for the first trilogy, and then there is going to be a 4th book. And I've actually just finished a little novella which is set into the far future, which still has roots based on this stuff. But that should be out shortly. It's called Confederate Rising, and I wrote it sort of like for a few friends of mine, mostly as a kind of an in-joke a little bit. But anyway, the point is, this stuff about the Nazi propaganda machine, you have no idea how powerful that is. We have been brainwashed into believing all sorts of things about the Second World War, the origins of it, the origin of the First World War, and yet the reality of it is so far from what you think you know, that once you realize it, once you see it, it becomes so disheartening. I mean, I wrote The Face on Mars in my 20s, and for a long while after that I was like, well, what the hell can I do about any of this? You know, I'm just one guy writing a book. There was some interesting things happened to me after I wrote that book. And my phone line was tapped, I was burglared, but nothing was taken other than the videos that I had of some of these UFO objects that I'd filmed for a few hours, because in South Africa, on a day that's also somewhat unfortunate, because it was the 1st of April, between the night of 31st of March and 1st of April, so April's Fool Day. There was a lot of activity, of UFO activity, and I filmed it for hours. I had witnesses with me, my girlfriend at the time, her brother. We actually went out in the car to like film over the sea, and some strange stuff happened there. Anyway, I wrote about part of this experience in the book, and the only thing that was stolen was those tapes. You know, I had money lying next to the bed and so on. Nothing else was taken except the camera that filmed the stuff and the tapes. And I had one copy of the tape that was left with my mother, and I have since digitized part of that film, but it's very degraded. You know, the tape was over 20 years old when I got it digitized, so you can't see the stuff that I saw back then. But anyway, the interesting thing is that I was working as a close protection services guy back then, and I had access to some people that had access to people in the national services. And I knew that my phone was doing something weird and was bugged. So I asked this friend of mine, listen, can we find out if my phone is being tapped? And this guy had a contact in the South African Secret Services, especially, was like friendly with him. And he said, yeah, we can find out. And they hooked up this weird machinery to my phone, and it was discovered that yes, I was being tapped. But the guy was shocked, because, you know, when he found that out, he said, but, you know, he said, yeah, you are being tapped, but the thing that I don't get is who the hell is doing it? Because all I can tell you is it's not us. You're not a person of interest to us in any way. So I don't know who the fuck is doing it. You know, so that was kind of interesting. And then I had all sorts of strange people come up to me. I mean, you know, some of these guys were absolutely crazy, but a few of these people were very serious individuals. That after they read that book, because it's chock full of information, it's chock full of references, I try as much as possible not to just give you my opinion. You know, what I'm doing now in a video, you think, oh, well, that's just what you're saying, dude. Fine, but you've now got Google, you've got DuckDuckGo, or rather, I prefer DuckDuckGo, but, you know, whatever. You can verify a lot of this information online now. Not all of it, but quite a lot of it. And you can verify the things I'm talking about yourself. So I'm not asking anybody to accept anything I'm saying as being gospel or truth. You know, just look into it yourself. Don't take my word for it, but look into it yourself. Just 2 words of warning. 1, it's a hell of a rabbit hole, and once you get into it and you start to realize how things work, you might get depressed, because it's a pretty dark sort of situation that we're in at the moment. It's not all bad, but most of it is pretty bad. And the people that run things, I believe there are some white hats in it, but there are certainly a lot of black hats in it too. And while some of the reasons for keeping a lot of the stuff secret and not allowing access to it for a multitude of reasons makes sense from a purely militaristic, strategic security point of view, from a personal human point of view, it's also kind of tragic. You know, if we have anti-gravity technology, we could be and should be colonizing other planets, visiting the stars, and so on. And that might be happening in secret to some extent. There's a reason for that too. And the fiction books cover a lot of this ground, a lot of this speculation, a lot better than I can in a non-fiction book. So some of it might be right, some of it might just be fiction. But the interesting thing is that, so the Overlords of Mars series, the first book I think came out in 2011. And it's quite a while ago. Second book came out in 2014, I think. And the third book, you know, as soon as I get a few days to actually work on it, maybe I'll get further along. But they present an overall picture that I think paints a much better idea of what's really going on. And the thing is, if anti-gravity technology is a reality, it can also be a reality that other intelligent races exist and might have had this longer than us, and might have visited around here for a long period of time. And what's going on Mars seems to indicate that this has probably been the case. So there's a lot of competing conspiracy queries, and a lot of different conspiracies, and a lot of different theories, and it's difficult to thread through all of them in a logical way, but you can still make a lot of sense out of quite a lot of things. So for part 1, what I wanted to really point out is that the way you think the world works is very far from the way the world actually works. And you're not going to be able to appreciate this until you understand the level of brainwashing that you've been subjected to. So, people like Owen Benjamin that talk about wizards and spellcasting, he's doing a service really to humanity, because he's trying to expose the fact that you can be brainwashed and you're not even aware of the fact that it's been done while it's been done. He's absolutely right. And I wanted to do a video on that a little bit later maybe. But there's so many things I want to talk about, One of them, and they're all related, because, for example, the propaganda of, people think, oh, the Catholic Church is filled with pedophiles. And it is, but it's not the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church stopped having a legitimate pope on the 20th of October of 1958. They haven't had a legitimate pope since then. And the popes that have been there have infiltrated and created Vatican II documents, which completely perverted the church. And that was the intent. The intent was to destroy the church and modify it, change the zeitgeist. The Nazis were defeated militarily, but they had enough money and they had these huge compounds in Argentina, and they affected huge things. Like the government of the United States was hugely affected by the Nazis. The Apollo program was essentially a Nazi program. The leaders of the Apollo program, the people who created the technology to be able to do the Apollo program, were Nazis. The fact that shortly after when Operation High Jump, this trip onto Antarctica that got their ass kicked and got sent back to America very quickly, shortly after that, the term flying saucer was coined. And where was it coined? It was coined by a guy called Arnold, I believe was his name. And it's because he saw 6 or 7 of these flying discs in Washington, D.C., not too far from the White House. So again, if you connect the dots a little bit, let's say, just for a moment, speculation now, let's say Hitler didn't die in the bunker. Him and Martin Bormann and a few other key Nazis, along with a bunch of others, went to Argentina where they had a base, and Hitler lived out his life there, probably died somewhere in the 60s. They created all these companies. They infiltrated the American government because they basically had Nazis doing the Apollo program. But before that, the Americans tried a last gasp to get the last Nazis out of Antarctica. Let's say the Nazis there did have this anti-gravity technology, kicked the Americans' ass, and then flew some of these discs practically over the White House. That's sending a pretty strong message. That's saying, we have a deal. We gave you guys enough enriched uranium that you could bomb the Japs, and now you're going to shut the fuck up and let us do whatever we want, because otherwise I'm going to take you out at home, in your house, you, the president, and you can't stop me because I've got anti-gravity vehicles that can run circles around the best planes you've got, and I can take you out right there. So there was a Cold War going on that nobody knew about, a secret war going on where the Nazis still had a lot of power, and they spread their tentacles. And again, this is not theory. There's information, there's factual, known documentation that the Nazis had secret organizations that would disseminate and help ex-Nazis to get positions in government, in work, in companies. This is a known fact. Odessa, I think, was the name of one of the operations. Anyway, so the Nazis didn't really quite lose. And if that's the case, then what happened? Eventually the Americans are going to develop this technology, and they did, because Thomas Townsend Brown in 1954 gave the Americans what he had, and he started working with them to develop it as a military weapon. The interesting thing is that in 1958, I think, I might be wrong on the date, but I think it's 1958, the Americans threw 3 atom bombs over Antarctica. What the hell for? You want to test atom bombs on Antarctica where the supposedly the ozone layer is so fragile and all that? Why would they do that? There's also a zone in Antarctica that's an exclusion zone where you're not allowed to go at all, which is a pretty decent place to build a base. If you're gonna have a base there, if there is an access to this area with submarines and so on, it would be a pretty cool place to have a base. And I think that there has been a base in Antarctica of Nazis. How big it was and the extent of it, I don't know. These are two books that are not very well known. There you go. And I think this is the first one, Adolf Hitler and the Secret of the Holy Lambs, by Colonel Howard A. Buchner and Captain Wilhelm Bernhardt. Wilhelm Bernhardt is a pen name. And he wrote a second one with the same person called Seeds of a New Reich. Now, I believe that Colonel Howard Buchner was I believe he was an honorable guy. He wrote some books, and he left a memorial to a friend of his who died, who was a Red Indian. And Colonel Buchner and his friend, whose name I forget, the Red Indian guy, they liberated some concentration camps at the end of the Second World War, and they saw what went on there. And the Red Indian guy, being a Red Indian, which I have a lot of respect for, had his own sense of justice, and pretty much, I think, allowed some of the prisoners to get a hold of the capos that had run the place and kill them, which I think was justice served and perfectly acceptable, but theoretically wasn't supposed to be the way to go. Now, the reason I think that Captain Buchner was a good guy is because his friend died of a lung disease. I can't remember if it was tuberculosis or something along those lines, but he died something to do with the lungs. And this guy is a doctor, and he spent his life trying to improve conditions for lung patients. Again, I can't remember if it was tuberculosis or something like that. And his book, I think, has things in it that are incorrect or probably wrong, but I don't think it was him that was saying the wrong thing. I think the guy that was giving him the information, the German guy who's only got a pen name in there, who was possibly one of the people in one of the two submarines that appeared in Mar del Plata months after the end of the war, in July and August of 1945, when the war ended in May, probably fed him some misinformation as well. But I think there's a very strong case to be made that there was indeed a secret base in Antarctica, and Colonel Butcher probably came the closest to telling the truth about it. The fact is, the history that you think you know is not the real history. If you weren't there yourself, you didn't physically see what would happen, you're never really going to know for sure, even the reasons for the origin of the First and Second World War are not what you're told they are. And that there is some very good evidence on that by a guy called Anthony Sutton. Anthony Sutton wrote 3 books about who financed the Reich, who financed Hitler, and it was Wall Street and Hitler, that financed Hitler essentially. So it was bankers that financed the wars. The Rothschild involvement in the wars is again denied publicly all over the place, and it's still pretty factual. Anyway, I'm gonna end with just one last little bit of just fun little conspiracy stuff. Just 1 second. So this is something that was given to me because of my work. It was found, this here, as you can see, is a bullet, which I have opened. Let me just open this so you don't have the reflection of the glass. So I've opened and glued it, but it's a pretty corroded bullet. The powder still works. I've covered it in glue now, but I've tested it before. If you put a match to that, it'll go up in flames. That is the lead part, and those are the copper bits that sort of fell off of it. Now the bullet is so corroded that you can't read exactly what it was and whatever, but the dimensions of it were clearly. So that got interrupted because I got a phone call. But anyway, so there's this bullet that was found in the grounds of Gunnersbury Park. Now, interesting enough, we found out what the bullet was. It's a Patron S, which was built between 1903 and 1914. But after 1914, there was an embargo on German ammunition, so it was very difficult to get that stuff into the rest of Europe. And it was the first smokeless powder bullet. So it's a bullet of German origin that was found, probably over 100 years later in Gunnersbury Park, and was given to me as a gift by the people who found it. The interesting thing is that the likelihood is that this bullet therefore is from 1903 to 1914. And at that point in time, Gunnersbury Park belonged to the Rothschilds. It might mean nothing, of course, but what's a German bullet from pre-World War I doing in the garden of the Rothschilds? Just one other question for your conspiracy queries.